Hey guys, tonight we step quietly onto the frost-hardened plains of Prussia, where the wind tastes like iron filings and the snow crunches beneath boots that haven't been dry since Advent. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Go on, share where you're listening from and what time it is for you, because somewhere out there you might actually be warmer than the Teutonic Knights ever were. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk out from the low timber barracks of a winter outpost, the one built too late in the season and too close to a river that's already frozen solid, and you can smell the damp leather, the half-burned pitch, and the faint odor of boiled oats clinging to everything like guilt. The nights around you move slowly, wrapped in layers that make them look more like bundled relics than men. The white crosses on their cloaks dulled to gray under weeks of snow. You can almost hear their joints complain beneath the armor, iron greaves rubbing against wool hose, chainmail dragging on padded gambesons, and you realize the sound of a Teutonic winter isn't gallant music or holy chants. It's the dull percussion of survival. One historical record from the Livonian Chronicle notes that temperatures dropped so low in 1402 that horses froze mid-step, their riders forced to saw them free of the ice to salvage saddles. You can't decide what's worse, the imagery or the practicality. You breathe in, and it's like swallowing pins. The campfire, or rather the thing that pretends to be one, is little more than a handful of embers clinging to life beneath a blackened pot. The men huddle around it anyway, not because it's warm, but because habit is a comfort older than reason. One knight mutters that God tests them with snow, because the devil fears the cold, a phrase that would sound noble if his nose weren't bright red and dripping. The reality, though, is that the Teutonic Order forbade open fires inside wooden strongholds for fear of smoke and sparks turning their carefully stored grain into ash. You can imagine the rule scroll, written in stern Latin, ordering no flame within the hall, because apparently hypothermia was less sinful than recklessness. The irony doesn't escape you. You picture yourself sitting in that drafty hall, hands trembling, sipping thin beer because water is unsafe and the river has become a decorative sculpture. Somewhere, a monk scratches parchment with stiff fingers, recording the weather as divine punishment. You try to rub your own hands, feeling phantom chill through the story itself. A mainstream historical fact worth remembering here is that the Teutonic Knights actually did maintain strict communal routines during winter mass before dawn, drills afterward, and prayers through chattering teeth, believing that discipline was as vital as food. But you can't pray away frostbite. The Order's annals describe knights found sleeping upright to preserve body heat, a phrase that makes you wonder if holiness includes mild rigor mortis. You can almost hear the faint rustle of parchment and smell the candle tallow dripping beside the scribe who noted it down, probably while wearing 3 hoods. The wind pushes against the outpost walls with a sigh, as if even nature is tired of itself. You step closer to the gatehouse, where the guards lean on their pikes, frost bearding their eyelashes. One nudges another, and mutters something about wolves because of course there are wolves, but the tone is more gossip than alarm. The beasts have better sense than men tonight. You glance at the narrow slits in the palisade and realize how small the world looks through fear and ice. Somewhere behind you, a novice spills a bucket of frozen water, and the crash sounds like shattered glass. He curses softly, then crosses himself twice to cancel it out. You smile. Even in the 13th century, workplace mishaps demanded multitasking. A quirky tidbit buried in one of the lesser-known chronicles of the Order tells us that the brothers sometimes warmed their gloves with bread from the chapel oven, a literal handout of the holy carb. Imagine walking into Mass just to stick your gauntlets in with the loaves. It's a miracle the bread didn't taste like chain oil. You picture it, trying not to laugh too loudly. Even frozen piety can have flavor. Meanwhile, snow piles higher against the ramparts, pressing in like time itself. The men move slower now, the rhythm of motion turning mechanical. Each sound, the clang of armor, the grunt of breath, the creak of timber, feels rehearsed. You wonder if this is how devotion fossilizes, one repetition at a time. Your feet crunch in rhythm with theirs, and you feel that strange calm that comes when everything hurts equally. The scholars back home like to debate whether the Teutonic Knights' endurance came from faith or fanaticism. Maybe it was neither. Maybe it was just boredom wrapped in armor. After all, a man can survive many things if he's too stubborn to die of them. You glance up and notice the stars, sharp, unblinking points above a sky so cold it looks brittle. The northern lights, faint and pale, stretch like ghost banners. You imagine one of the brothers waking in the night, seeing them and swearing the Virgin herself is sending signals in green fire. Who could blame him? When everything around you is white and dead, even imagination counts as warmth. A scribe might later record it as a sign of divine endurance, while some modern historian calls it optical refraction over frozen marsh vapor. Same sky, different marketing department. You lean against a log wall and feel the rough bark through layers of cloth. The smell of pitch and horse dung mixes with something faintly metallic, blood from a cracked lip, maybe. Someone starts humming a hymn, out of tune but earnest. You half expect him to start beatboxing just to keep circulation going. The melody floats upward and disappears, stolen by the wind. You try humming along quietly, letting the rhythm calm you, realizing that the hum isn't for God, it's for sanity. It's white noise with theological approval. The candlelight flickers inside the main hall, revealing men sleeping sitting up, their helmets hanging from pegs like silent bells. One coughs, another snores. A third whispers a prayer that sounds suspiciously like a grocery list of things he misses. Warm bread, dry socks, maybe a fireplace. You think of how modern comfort has spoiled you. You can't even handle a slightly cold pillowcase, and these guys are out here freezing their armor off, literally. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl calls, and for a moment everything stops. The soldiers, the wind, even your thoughts. It's as if the entire landscape holds its breath. Then, slowly, life resumes. A shuffle, a sigh, the creak of a boot. You realize this quiet rhythm is the real heartbeat of medieval winter. Slow, steady, stubborn. You remember one open scholarly debate that still lingers among historians. Were these winter quarters a sign of tactical brilliance or logistical folly? Some claim the order's iron discipline allowed them to outlast pagan tribes through sheer endurance. Others argue it was spiritual vanity disguised as fortitude, a frozen PR stunt. You, standing here in imagination, can see both sides. The fort is a monument to control, but also to the human need to prove something to itself, even when no one's watching. The snow thickens. You watch it drift into door cracks, onto cloaks, into the crevices of armor. One knight wipes his blade with snow just to keep it from rusting. Another uses his breath to polish a crossguard. You realize that in this place maintenance is prayer. Every act of care is faith in motion. You start to feel your eyelids heavy, lulled by repetition, the hiss of the wind, the soft clank of steel, the faint sound of someone trying to whistle through numb lips. You let your mind drift, imagining the same landscape centuries later, where archaeologists in neon parkas scrape at the frozen ground and find rusted nails, bits of chain, a broken spoon. They argue over what it all means. Publish papers with titles like Thermal Austerity and Symbolic Endurance in Baltic Crusader Encampments. You smile because that's just modern Latin for these guys were freezing and stubborn about it. You step back one last time to look at the outpost, the crooked fence half buried in snow, the flicker of light behind shutters, the smell of damp wool. Somewhere a monk finishes a prayer, whispering Deus Vult, more as habit than conviction. You breathe out, watching your breath fade into mist, thinking how it must have felt to live in a world where even exhaling looked like a ghost leaving your body. And as the wind picks up again, wrapping you in its thin arms, you realize you've already joined them, not in armor, but in the universal ritual of trying to stay warm in a cold and complicated world. You wake into a gray half-light that feels less like morning and more like the continuation of some long, cold joke. Your armor is a personal glacier. The breath rising from your lips crystallizes before it has a chance to regret existing, and every buckle, clasp, and rivet on your body has turned into a frost-covered act of penance. You shift a little, feeling metal grating against frozen cloth, and it occurs to you that whoever invented chainmail clearly didn't field test it at -20 degrees. Somewhere, your teeth chatter in Morse code, probably spelling send soup. You step out into the courtyard, boots cracking the ice that formed overnight like thin glass over misery. Around you, the other knights are already awake, or rather, already vertical. Sleep is less an activity here, and more a brief intermission between shivers. Their breath clouds mix in the air. A ghostly congregation. Someone coughs. Someone sneezes, and someone swears quietly before remembering he's supposed to be holy. The humor of it all hits you. Men wrapped in the finest steel the 13th century could make, utterly defeated by weather. The phrase cold steel takes on a theological dimension here. It's not just an object, it's an experience. You can almost hear a medieval weaponsmith somewhere laughing into his forge, saying, "They'll thank me later." They didn't. You pause beside a half-frozen water barrel, looking at your reflection warped by thin ice. You don't look like a warrior of God. You look like a piece of furniture that someone left outside overnight. Behind you, a young squire bangs his gauntlets together like cymbals trying to restore circulation, while another rubs his nose until it turns the exact color of repentance. A mainstream historical fact worth remembering here is that the Teutonic Order, unlike many medieval armies, treated its armor as both uniform and identity. It wasn't just protection, it was the habit of a monk, the robe of a priest, and the exoskeleton of faith all rolled into one. But faith doesn't conduct heat. Some modern historians still argue whether they even wore full mail beneath their surcoats during winter or swapped it out for padded layers. The surviving documents are unclear, as if even the chronicler's ink froze mid-sentence. One German scholar insists they went without armor to preserve warmth, while a Polish one countered that they'd rather freeze than look unholy. The debate continues, buried under academic snowdrifts of speculation and ego. You lift your arm and hear the faint squeal of ice cracking in the chain links. The sound is weirdly satisfying, like stepping on frozen puddles. You test the flexibility, limited but not hopeless, and imagine the daily ritual of maintaining this metallic prison. Every evening, the brothers scrape rust off their gear with bits of wool soaked in vinegar, and the smell alone could probably exorcise demons. You find yourself wondering what they'd think of modern conveniences like WD-40, or heated gloves, probably witchcraft. There's a legend recorded in a Livonian chronicle that one knight tried lining his breastplate with fur from a lynx, claiming it kept him as warm as a fox in sin. Unfortunately, the fur trapped moisture, froze solid, and cracked. They buried both man and lynx fur together, which feels poetic in a very medieval way. You smile at the absurdity. Survival back then was 10% prayer, 90% trial and error. Mostly error. Around midday. Not that anyone can tell. The camp stirs into what passes for activity. The men stretch their limbs, perform drills that look more like collective shivering, and polish armor that refuses to shine. The master of the order walks by, his white cloak stiff with frost, looking like a saint sculpted out of snow. He says something about endurance, about how their metal must mirror their souls, unyielding, pure, and cold. You nod respectfully while thinking that maybe, just maybe, the Almighty wouldn't mind a little bonfire. The irony is rich enough to warm you for a moment. You notice how the armor catches the light, tiny sparkles of frost shimmering across every edge. It's beautiful in a grim sort of way, like diamonds that hate you. You can see why chroniclers romanticize these men, gleaming knights of ice, marching in silence, faces hidden behind visors that conceal equal parts devotion and regret. A quirky tidbit comes from a manuscript fragment stored in Königsberg. It mentions that some brothers secretly sprinkled salt on their armor before campaigns, believing it kept the frost demons from gnawing at the iron. You can't decide if that's superstition or proto-chemistry. After all, salt does lower freezing points. Maybe they accidentally invented de-icing centuries early, calling it an exorcism instead of science. You imagine the scene: a knight solemnly chanting prayers over a handful of table salt while another sneaks a lick, because electrolytes are electrolytes. The line between faith and practicality was always thin out here, thinner than the ice on the river. By afternoon, the armor has warmed just enough to steam faintly when you move. It's a strange sight, an army of kettles on legs. The heat from your body rises trapped, then escapes in little clouds that make you look like a walking chimney of penance. You take a few steps and feel the sweat start to betray you, freezing again as soon as you stop. It's a cycle that would make even the devil give up in frustration. The horses, poor creatures, stand tied near the wall, shaking their manes, breath puffing like fog machines. One knight gently pats his destrier's neck, murmuring apologies. The animal responds by sneezing in his face, a baptism of frost and hay. Somewhere, a monk notes in his journal that the beasts endure without complaint. You snort quietly. The beasts are probably writing the same thing about the monks. As the day bleeds into its colorless twilight, you find yourself watching a group of brothers at work by the forge. It's barely functional, too cold for proper heat, but they hammer anyway, more out of ritual than necessity. The clang of iron on iron echoes through the courtyard, a heartbeat that keeps the world from falling asleep entirely. Sparks jump, die instantly, leaving behind little ghosts of light. You stand there, entranced, feeling that mix of admiration and absurdity again. Every blow seems like a conversation with the elements. We refuse to stop, and the elements answer. We don't care. The hammerers grin anyway. That's humanity for you. There's one open scholarly debate that persists among historians of the order: whether this obsession with maintaining full armor in brutal conditions was a practical deterrent against ambushes or a symbolic act of penitence. Was the armor meant to protect from enemies or from sin? The chroniclers themselves seem confused. Some write of the armor as God's skin, others as man's vanity frozen into steel. You suspect it was both. A man inside a shell of iron can pretend he's more than flesh, more than fear, more than the sum of his shivers. Maybe that's what faith is at its coldest, pretending long enough that it starts to feel real. The night settles early. The stars blink through the thin clouds, and your armor, now cooling again, begins its slow return to discomfort. You sit on a log, the wood frozen solid, and listen to the small noises that make up medieval quiet: the jingle of a chain, the snort of a horse, the muffled cough of a man who's half praying, half freezing. You start to think that the sound of the order wasn't battle hymns, it was this symphony of subtle suffering. You flex your fingers, noticing how numbness has its own kind of peace. There's no pain if nothing feels at all. Somewhere in the background a brother hums a hymn about eternal fire, and you can't help but chuckle softly. Wrong element, buddy. You tilt your head back, watching the breath drift toward the stars. For a second, you imagine you're one of those constellations, rigid, metallic, fixed forever above a land too cold for mercy. You wonder if the Teutonic Knights, with all their iron and ice, were ever truly human beneath it all. Maybe that's why we're fascinated by them now. They turned endurance into a religion, discomfort into identity. You sit there until the frost starts reclaiming you again, every exhale turning into a tiny halo that fades as quickly as it forms. And as you close your eyes, hearing the distant creak of frozen armor settling like a sigh, you realize that out here warmth isn't a sensation, it's a story you keep telling yourself to survive. You wake to the sound of someone hammering bread against a table, and it takes you a few seconds to realize that's not a joke, it's breakfast. The knight doing the hammering pauses, shakes his head, and mutters something about how God must have meant for teeth to be stronger in the 13th century. You shuffle over, still half asleep, and stare at what looks more like masonry than food. The loaf is small, square, and grayish, like something stolen from the wall of a monastery instead of baked inside one. You pick up a piece, tap it against your helmet, and wince as the echo rings out like a church bell. Somewhere behind you, a squire says, "If it breaks, it's ready." You can't tell if he means the bread or your jaw. The morning is bitter, the kind of cold that sneaks into your bones while pretending to be air. And the men eat quickly, not because the food is good, but because it's the only thing with calories that hasn't frozen solid. The rations are dwindling. Flour's been stretched with ground peas and sawdust, the way every starving army has done since time began. And it tastes exactly like a confession you didn't mean to make. You chew, you swallow, you live another day. A mainstream historical fact about the Teutonic Knights is that their winter rations were infamously monotonous: rye bread, salted meat, dried peas, and beer that froze into slush by morning. Chronicles describe entire campaigns fought on nothing but hardtack and faith, which sounds heroic until you imagine the constipation. Their supply routes from Königsberg and Marienburg were often cut by weather or raiders, so the knights relied heavily on stores they'd baked and dried months earlier. By the time January rolled around, that bread was as edible as a sermon carved in wood. And yet they kept at it, calling it God's sustenance, which feels like medieval marketing at its finest. You can picture the supply master defending himself. Yes, it tastes like despair, but it lasts forever. Technically true, mold can't grow on regret. You take another bite and feel something crunch. It's not clear if it's grain or tooth enamel. A knight across from you dips his piece into melted snow to soften it, and suddenly you understand medieval innovation, desperation. You do the same, pretending it's soup, pretending the cold water doesn't make the bread even sadder. Someone says grace aloud, thanking the Lord for nourishment, and you almost laugh because at this point, gratitude is less about the meal and more about the illusion of civilization. Behind you, the cook, a man whose job title is almost ironic, stirs something in a cauldron. It smells faintly of onions and doubt. He ladles out portions of what he calls stew, though the ingredients are mainly hope and yesterday's bread softened with melted snow. You sip it anyway, and for a moment the warmth feels like forgiveness. A quirky tidbit buried in a Hanseatic merchant's letter from 1388 claims that Teutonic bread was so hard it could shatter upon the table and be reassembled for eating later. Imagine that modular food centuries before IKEA. Another note mentions that some knights etched small crosses into their loaves before baking, believing it would make them more digestible. Science disagrees, but faith apparently helped the metabolism. You picture a brother carving a holy symbol into dough, muttering prayers as if God were a sous chef, then burning it anyway because the oven was built by amateurs who thought airflow was a sin. Still, the ritual mattered. When everything else freezes, meaning has to stay warm somehow. You step outside with your piece of holy rock in hand, watching the pale sun struggle through clouds like a dying candle. The snow sparkles deceptively, as if mocking the poverty of the meal. You hear laughter from a group of squires nearby. Someone's discovered that if you soak bread overnight and reheat it on a shield, it becomes almost edible. Almost, of course. Doing a lot of work in that sentence, you walk over to inspect the experiment. A dented shield resting over a few embers, with hunks of bread sizzling and steaming faintly. The smell is You compliment him with all the sincerity of a frozen diplomat. A drop of grease splatters on his gauntlet, hissing, and for one glorious second everyone feels human again. You think about how every civilization measures wealth differently. For these knights, bread was treasure, counted, guarded, prayed over. In their winter ledgers there's more math about loaves than weapons. You can imagine the scribe sighing, writing lines like 12 loaves consumed, 2 spoiled, 1 lost to mice. May God judge the mice. You glance toward the storage hut where the food is kept, a small wooden fortress within the fortress. A guard stands there like it's the Ark of the Covenant. You wonder what he'd do if someone actually tried to steal bread, probably recite a psalm before hitting them with one. The wind picks up again, swirling snow across the yard, and the smell of burned crust drifts toward you like incense for the absurdly faithful. There's an open scholarly debate among food historians, yes, that's a real profession, about whether medieval hard bread was intentionally baked to stone-like hardness for preservation or simply the result of poor ovens. Some argue it was a deliberate technique, dry enough to last months, light enough to carry. Others think it was just incompetence sanctified by necessity. Either way, you're chewing history and it's dry. You start to appreciate how survival here wasn't just about strength, it was about imagination. Every meal was an act of denial, pretending it tastes fine, pretending you're not freezing, pretending tomorrow will be easier. It's the medieval version of optimism, just with fewer vitamins. Later, as the day limps on, a monk sets up a small wooden table near the chapel, distributing communion wafers that look suspiciously similar to breakfast. You can't help but think, if salvation tastes this bland, maybe purgatory comes with seasoning. He blesses each brother solemnly, his breath fogging the air like holy smoke. The men kneel, their armor creaking, crumbs falling like snow onto their boots. You watch one knight carefully save his wafer for later. Spiritual insurance in edible form. It's both reverent and deeply practical. The line between prayer and meal planning has officially blurred. When evening arrives, you find yourself inside the hall again, surrounded by the smell of smoke and stale bread. The walls hum with wind, and someone has lit a single candle that barely competes with the darkness. The men talk quietly about home, about bakeries that sold bread soft enough to tear with fingers, about mothers who added honey, about feasts where butter was more than a memory. Their voices are gentle now, slow with nostalgia. You feel it, too, that ache for flavor, for color, for anything that doesn't crunch like guilt. You imagine what would happen if you could hand them a modern croissant or even a humble slice of toast. They'd probably knight you on the spot. One knight near you, his beard rimed with frost, begins telling a story. How during a particularly harsh winter in Livonia, the brothers mixed beer and bread into a paste to form edible bricks, jokingly called Crusaders' mortar. He laughs, and everyone else joins in because laughter is warmer than soup. For a brief moment, the hall feels alive, less a tomb, more a tavern. You realize that humor, like yeast, is what makes the human spirit rise. Outside, the storm thickens again, wind howling like it has opinions. You finish the last of your bread, softened by beer, and look at the men around you, faces red, eyes tired but still somehow radiant with stubborn belief. You think about how future historians will romanticize this misery into valor, how artists will paint it as golden devotion. But standing here, chewing the world's hardest dinner, you know the truth. Heroism often starts because no one can think of a better option. You close your eyes, letting the sounds blur the low hum of hymns, the crack of ice, the faint chuckle of men who've learned to laugh at suffering. And for the first time tonight, you feel full. Not from food, but from the strange, sustaining comfort of knowing that even frozen nights with broken teeth could still find reasons to smile before another endless, fireless night. You wake before dawn to the muffled snort of horses, those poor noble creatures that have somehow agreed to suffer alongside you in this great frozen theater of faith and futility. Their breath clouds in the dim air like small ghosts, white vapor rising in rhythm with the slow shifting of hooves over ice-slick ground. The stables are little more than rough timber frames stuffed with straw that now crunches like kindling. You step inside, and the smell hits you. Hay, sweat, and despair. It's oddly comforting, proof that something still produces heat in this snow-choked world. The horses turn their heads toward you, eyes wide and solemn, as if to say, "Remind me again whose idea this was." You murmur an apology they don't understand but seem to accept. A knight beside you coughs, his breath a pale banner in the air, and mutters that even the beasts are holier than men, they at least don't complain. You resist the urge to tell him they're complaining right now. Loudly, through every labored breath. You walk past a line of massive destriers, their coats dull and matted from frost. Their manes hang stiff as icicles, tails caked in mud. The armor they wear, heavy plate barding designed to impress God or terrify pagans, now feels like cruelty disguised as devotion. One poor animal stamps its foot, shivering, and you remember a mainstream historical fact from the Chronicon Livoniae. The Teutonic Order prized its horses as symbols of divine might, importing them from Friesland and Saxony at ruinous cost. Each one was worth more than most peasants' lives. Yet here they stand, ribs faintly visible beneath their padded coverings, snorting steam into a sky that doesn't care. Chroniclers praise the knights for treating their mounts as brothers in arms, though you suspect brotherhood looked a lot like shared suffering and mutual frostbite. You reach out, touch the muzzle of one gelding and feel the skin cold as river stones. He exhales into your palm, a brief miracle of warmth that vanishes too fast. Someone shouts for water, but of course the bucket's frozen solid again. Two squires hack at it with daggers until the blade snaps, and one of them mutters something that sounds suspiciously like a medieval swear. A monk passing by glares disapprovingly, though he's holding a candle so small it's mostly wick. The knights, being practical men when no one's watching, start melting snow in their helmets to make drinkable water for the horses. You watch the absurdity unfold. A line of armored men crouched like penitents, offering makeshift chalices of snowmelt to beasts that drink greedily. If there's ever been an image of humility, this is it. Holy warriors reduced to stable boys by the unnegotiable will of winter. You can almost hear the universe laughing softly in Latin. A quirky tidbit from one 14th century inventory mentions that during particularly harsh campaigns, the order rationed ale for horses to warm their blood and brighten their mood. Yes, medieval animal husbandry apparently included happy hour. You imagine a knight carefully pouring beer into a trough while a horse eyes him with deep suspicion, wondering what kind of confession this will require later. The chronicler claims the experiment was met with cheer among both man and beast, though the following page describes multiple slippery incidents, suggesting inebriated destriers may not have been the tactical advantage they hoped for. You can't help but laugh at the picture, armored men and horses weaving slightly as they march, dignity freezing somewhere behind them. You step out into the courtyard again, watching a team harness two horses to a small sled loaded with firewood, one of the few resources that hasn't deserted them yet. The sled creaks, the runners squeal, and the horses strain forward, muscles rippling beneath frost-crusted hides. The knight guiding them murmurs in low German, his tone halfway between prayer and complaint. The animals obey, not because they understand the words, but because obedience is the only thing left to do. You wonder what drives them. Habit, fear, loyalty, or maybe just the same resigned persistence that keeps the men alive. There's a saying scratched into the stable wall in crude Latin, equus sanctior quam homo. The horse is holier than man. You suspect whoever carved it wasn't joking. As daylight grows, weak and yellow like a candle behind wax paper, you help rub down one of the mounts with coarse cloth. The static crackles through your fingers, tiny sparks of defiance against the cold. The knight beside you jokes that at least now you're both warm from the effort, which is only half true. Your hands ache, your arms tremble, but your spirit somehow stirs a little. There's something grounding about caring for a creature that doesn't pretend to understand salvation. It just breathes, eats, endures. That's theology in its purest form. Then comes the ritual shoeing, an ordeal worthy of sainthood. The blacksmith's hammer rings dull and slow. The metal must be heated gently so it doesn't shatter from the cold. Every strike releases a puff of steam, a fragile miracle against the wind. Sparks leap, then die. Tiny stars extinguished by frost. The horse stands patient, eyes half-lidded, while the smith works, murmuring something halfway between prayer and profanity. You lean closer and see the faint shimmer of ice on his beard. He grins at you, teeth flashing white in the gloom, and says through chattering lips, "We forge faith the same way, slowly and with many cracks." It's a good line. You decide to remember it. Later, as the afternoon wanes, the knights lead the horses down to the river. The ice groans beneath their hooves, a deep resonant sound that vibrates through your bones. The men test it carefully, spreading their weight, guiding the animals one step at a time. The sun, if it's fair to call that dim glow a sun, casts long blue shadows across the ice, turning everything into a painting of silence and tension. You feel your heart race as one horse slips slightly, its shoes scraping sparks against the frozen surface. But it steadies, exhales, continues. You realize that survival here is less about bravery and more about balance, literal and spiritual. An open scholarly debate still persists about whether the order's horses were intentionally left unshod in winter to prevent slipping on ice. Some historians insist they wrapped the hooves in rawhide for traction. Others argue such accounts were embellishments from romantic chroniclers. The archaeological evidence is inconclusive, because, unsurprisingly, very few medieval horses left Yelp reviews. You look down at your own boots, slick with frost, and think maybe both are true. People do whatever it takes not to fall. By evening, the horses are fed again. A generous word for what amounts to straw and frozen oats. The knights whisper blessings over the troughs, not out of superstition but habit. You watch one of the younger squires brush his favorite mare's mane, humming softly through chattering teeth. The horse leans closer, pressing her head against his shoulder, both of them steam-wreathed in shared breath. The moment is so tender it almost hurts to witness. You look away, pretending to study a snowdrift. In this frozen world, affection feels like rebellion. Night comes early, swallowing color, flattening sound. The stable lamps flicker, halos of yellow in a sea of blue-gray darkness. You sit beside one of the stalls, listening to the steady rhythm of breathing. The animals, the men, yourself. It's hypnotic, the kind of sound that dissolves thought. The air smells faintly of leather and hope. A knight near you murmurs a verse from the Psalms. He giveth to the beast his food, and to the young ravens which cry. You wonder if that includes horses drunk on beer. The monk nods solemnly, perhaps thinking the same thing. You lean your head against a post, letting the hum of existence lull you. For all the order's rigidity, there's something achingly human about this place. Men who bless beasts, beasts who save men, and snow that sanctifies them both by sheer endurance. You close your eyes, the world fading into the quiet rustle of straw, and the slow, sacred rhythm of hooves shifting in sleep. Out here faith isn't built in chapels. It's breathed out in clouds that vanish into the dark, shared between creatures who have no choice but to keep standing. You walk through a corridor that smells of pine pitch, candle smoke, and damp wool, and for once the noise of armor fades behind you until only your footsteps remain, soft, hesitant, swallowed by cold air. Ahead lies the chapel, the one place where the Teutonic Order insists warmth doesn't come from fire but from faith. The wooden door resists your push, hinges stiff from frost, and when it finally opens, a gust of snow slips in like an uninvited penitent. Inside, the silence feels heavy, thick enough to touch. The air glows faintly from a few candles struggling to stay alive, each one bowed under the weight of its own wax. You notice how the flames shiver whenever someone exhales nearby, as if even breath is too loud here. The brothers kneel in rows along rough benches, cloaks drawn tight, gauntleted hands clasped in prayer. Their armor gleams dully, frosted at the edges, turning the dim candlelight into a small constellation of suffering. Somewhere near the altar, a monk's voice hums through a verse of Ave Maris Stella, but his throat is dry, his tone wavers, and the hymn comes out like wind whispering through reeds. You stand near the back, your own breath misting into small prayers that dissolve before they're heard. Outside, the wind groans against the walls, rattling the narrow stained glass like a sigh from heaven. You realize that here, faith and frost compete to see which one can outlast the other. A mainstream historical fact about the Teutonic Order's winter practice is that prayer services continued even when temperatures inside the chapels dropped below freezing. Records from Marienburg and Riga mention priests conducting Mass wearing fur-lined hoods beneath their vestments, and acolytes forced to thaw communion wine near their bodies before consecration. One chronicler notes, perhaps proudly, that the order kept faith where fires were forbidden, which sounds poetic until you imagine everyone's lips cracking from reciting Latin. The rule against indoor fires was partly spiritual. Smoke represented impurity, and partly practical, since wood was too precious to burn for comfort. Yet somehow they convinced themselves that endurance itself was holy. You sit on a frozen bench, trying to decide whether that's admirable or just impressive self-delusion. The priest raises the chalice, a thin mist of condensation swirling from its rim. His hands tremble, not from doubt but from physics. The wine has thickened, almost syrupy, and he handles it like liquid glass. He murmurs the words of blessing, voice low, a rhythm that blends with the faint crackle of candle wicks. For a moment, it's beautiful, the kind of fragile beauty that exists only when everything else is bleak. You can hear armor creaking as men cross themselves, and beneath that sound, the steady drip of melting wax like the world keeping time. Then the monk with the censer steps forward, swinging it gently, though the incense within is reluctant to burn. The smoke that rises is thin, gray, and smells faintly of cedar and wishful thinking. You breathe it in anyway, because it's the closest thing to warmth available. A squire near you sneezes, tries to muffle it, and gets elbowed by his superior for disturbing the holiness. You smile inwardly. Even in the 13th century, hierarchy never slept. A quirky tidbit buried in a Livonian account mentions that the order occasionally mixed powdered snow into their incense when supplies ran low, claiming the purity of the elements magnified the blessing. In reality, it probably just made the place smell like wet wood and disappointment, but no one dared say so. You imagine some poor novice tasked with collecting fresh, untrampled snow for God, stumbling out into a blizzard with a brass bucket, muttering complaints under his breath. He returns half-frozen, dumps his sacred slush into the censer, and the monks all nod gravely at their own innovation. Religion and resourcefulness often share the same hat. As the service continues, you start to notice the details. The sound of armor plates shifting with each kneel, the faint click of rosary beads frozen to gloves, the thin wisp of a candle flame bending under the draft. It's not grand or theatrical. It's tired, reverent, and oddly tender. These men who fight in God's name spend their nights begging Him not to let their fingers fall off. The contradiction is almost comforting. Humility dressed in steel. You watch one knight kneel longer than the rest, his head bowed so low the candlelight brushes his helmet. Maybe he's praying for victory, maybe for sleep, maybe for socks. Whatever it is, the universe listens in silence. There's an open scholarly debate about whether the Teutonic Knights' devotion was born from genuine belief or institutional performance, a kind of medieval branding exercise. Some modern historians argue that their piety served as propaganda to justify endless campaigns. Others insist the harsh conditions forged an authentic spirituality grounded in shared suffering. Standing here, watching lips move through mist, you suspect the truth lies somewhere in between. Faith is rarely pure. It's usually a negotiation between fear and hope. You see it now, written in frost on every visor and whispered through chattering teeth. The monk finishes the final prayer. A brief, shivering pause. Then, one by one, the men stand, their armor groaning in protest. They move slowly toward the exit, heads bowed, not in reverence but from the weight of exhaustion. The candle flames stretch after them like tiny hands, then flicker out as the door opens to the cold. You stay behind for a moment, letting the silence close around you. The walls creak. The last of the incense curls upward and disappears into the rafters. You look toward the altar where a wooden crucifix hangs, the Christ figure rimmed with frost. His carved eyes seem to glisten, not from divine presence but from condensation. Somehow that feels just as holy. You walk forward, touch the altar stone, and it's so cold it burns. There's something honest about that. Pain is proof of contact. You bow your head, not because you're commanded to, but because the quiet demands it. You think of all the prayers uttered here over the years, some heard, most lost in the wind. You think of the rule forbidding fire, of how faith tried to be its own furnace. You almost admire it, that stubborn refusal to yield warmth to the body when it could instead be given to the soul. But as your fingertips go numb, you start to wonder if maybe God never asked for that much suffering. Maybe humans just like to make devotion theatrical. When you finally step outside, the wind greets you like a reprimand. Snow swirls, catching in your eyelashes, and the sound of horses from the stable drifts faintly through the night. Behind you, the chapel glows faintly from within, a lantern for a world that long ago stopped looking for light. You breathe in, watching your exhale fade into the air, and realize that prayer, like warmth, is something you keep making even when it doesn't seem to work, because the act itself is what keeps you alive. You fall asleep sitting upright, as most of them do, half in armor, half in exhaustion, your back pressed against a wooden wall that hums with the faint rhythmic creaks of wind and ice. You didn't mean to drift off. You only closed your eyes to rest them from the candlelight. But here you are, somewhere between consciousness and the memory of it, where the weight of your armor becomes both cocoon and cage. It's a strange kind of sleep, the kind forged by fatigue so deep it stops caring about comfort. You can feel the cold iron against your ribs even in dreams, the pressure of chain links etched into your skin like a prayer written in metal. Your body aches with the shape of faith. The hall is quiet except for the occasional snore, cough, or a muttered word, fragments of half-dreams escaping through chattering teeth. It sounds almost musical, this communal murmuring, as if every man here is humming his own private hymn in the key of frostbite. You drift through that soundscape, half dreaming of warmth that no longer exists. In your mind, the armor becomes lighter. The snow outside stops its endless assault, and you walk through a world glazed in silver. The moon paints the camp in pale light, the banners frozen mid-motion, and everything looks peaceful in that cruel, indifferent way only winter can manage. Somewhere, in that blurred realm between wakefulness and history, you imagine a figure, one of the old Grand Masters, perhaps, walking among the sleeping men, his armor untouched by frost, his face hidden behind a visor that reflects the stars. He whispers something you can't quite hear, a Latin benediction, or maybe just the sound of wind through metal. For a heartbeat, you feel blessed. Then a snore breaks the spell. Welcome back to reality. A mainstream historical fact to hold on to here. Chroniclers describe how the Teutonic Knights sometimes slept in full or partial armor during campaigns, not out of readiness but necessity. The cold made removing mail dangerous. Once it was off, you might not have the strength to put it back on again, and frostbite could set in before dawn. Contemporary accounts even mention that some men slept standing, leaning against walls, so that the armor might remain warm by breath and body. You picture that image, the absurdity and devotion of it, and realize this isn't heroism, it's engineering born of desperation. You rub your shoulder where the imagined weight presses hardest, and even in storytelling it feels heavy. The dream reshapes itself, as dreams tend to do, without permission. You're suddenly in a vast hall that isn't yours. The same chapel, maybe, but brighter, grander, filled with banners that flutter though there's no wind. The armor you wear now gleams like water under moonlight. You can hear distant chanting, 100 voices singing something so low and resonant it feels like the earth's heartbeat. The sound wraps around you, pulls you forward, but when you reach the altar, the figures kneeling there turn their heads and you see your own face reflected in every visor. Rows and rows of you, frozen mid-prayer. You wake with a start, the echo still in your ears. Someone nearby shifts, mutters a curse, goes still again. The candles have long since died, leaving only the blue-black glow of pre-dawn leaking through gaps in the walls. You exhale slowly. The air bites back. A quirky tidbit passed down through a 15th century manuscript, known as the Prussian Winter Chronicle, claims that the brothers sometimes experienced what they called holy wanderings of the soul, episodes where men rose in their sleep and walked fully armored through camp, eyes open but minds elsewhere. One account insists a knight was found at dawn standing in the river ice, murmuring the Lord's Prayer in his sleep, sword raised like a banner. Scholars debate whether it was exhaustion, hypothermia, or divine trance. You can't help but picture the scene, a sleepwalking crusader, helmet gleaming with frost, reciting Latin into the void while the snow falls quietly around him. Maybe it was madness, maybe something holier. Either way, it's proof that the line between prayer and dreaming is thinner than steel. You shift your position, trying to stretch without clanking too loudly. The armor groans. Your breath fogs the air before your face like a ghost escaping your lips. Outside, someone rings the small handbell that marks the approach of dawn prayer, and groans ripple through the barracks. You don't move yet. You stay still, cocooned in your own metallic shell, thinking about how the armor both protects and isolates. It keeps you alive but keeps you apart. You can't feel a friendly touch through steel, can't hug, can't even scratch your nose properly. It's strange how something meant to preserve the body ends up freezing the soul. You close your eyes again, not to sleep, but to remember warmth, the kind that came from laughter or sunlight or even embarrassment. You realize you've forgotten the last time you felt your skin against the air without flinching. The men around you start stirring, the sound of clattering metal filling the hall like morning bells. A knight jokes that his armor's trying to crawl off without him, and another replies that it probably has better sense. You smile. Humor here is armor too, thinner but lighter. The master of the order enters briefly, wrapped in a cloak so stiff with frost it could stand on its own. He offers a brief prayer and a longer sigh, reminding everyone that vigilance must not fade, that the body may rest but the spirit must remain alert. You wonder if that's theological wisdom or just his way of saying he hasn't slept either. There's an open scholarly debate still argued in academic papers with unnecessarily poetic titles about whether these long winters in armor contributed to the mysticism later associated with the Teutonic Order. Some claim that sensory deprivation and physical hardship led to visions, the kind chronicled as miracles. Others insist it was just exhaustion misinterpreted by desperate minds. You think about that as you stare at the wooden rafters above, crusted with frost that glitters faintly in the dim light. Maybe revelation and hallucination share a border, and the only thing separating saint from madman is how good his Latin sounds while freezing to death. You finally stand, joints cracking, armor complaining in every possible octave. Your feet ache. Your breath feels like smoke, but you move because movement is life here. Outside, the snow reflects the first pale blush of morning. It's not sunrise, just slightly less darkness. The horses stamp somewhere near the gate. A squire hands you a helmet that feels colder than logic. You hesitate before putting it on. The inside lined with frost, the smell of iron familiar and terrible. For a moment you catch your own reflection in the curved steel, a blur of humanity behind layers of endurance, and you think about how every man here wears the same disguise, piety on the outside, exhaustion underneath. You take one deep breath and slide the helmet over your head. The sound changes instantly, muffled, hollow. You can hear your own heartbeat now, echoing faintly inside the metal dome. It's comforting in an eerie way, like sharing a room with yourself. The world outside fades to dull thuds and echoes, and suddenly you understand why some chroniclers describe the order as men of silence. Inside armor, there's only you and the noise of your own existence. You close your eyes for just a second longer, standing perfectly still, and imagine the sound of the frozen river outside, the whisper of banners, the distant prayer you can't quite remember. And when you open them again, you realize that sleep and waking, faith and fatigue, devotion and delusion, all of it blurs together out here, until every breath feels like both a confession and a dream. You step into what passes for an infirmary, a room that smells of pine resin, vinegar, and something faintly metallic that may or may not be blood. And the first thing you notice is the silence, the kind of silence that waits for someone to break it with a cough. The air feels thicker here, heavy with the breath of suffering men, and the wet chill of melted snow. The walls are lined with bundles of herbs now frozen solid, their once green leaves brittle and pale like tiny flags of surrender. In the corner, a monk apothecary hunches over a small wooden table, grinding what looks like ice crystals in a mortar, the pestle squeaking with effort. He glances up, his face half hidden under a wool hood stiff with frost, and gives you a nod that might be greeting or warning. It's hard to tell the difference when both mean "don't die in my shift." You move closer, boots crunching over rushes frozen into the floor, and look down at the rows of bottles along the table. Their contents are indistinguishable, each one a different shade of probably expired. Labels written in Latin curl at the edges, letters blurring into icicles. The monk mumbles to himself as he works, reciting the ingredients of some concoction that could either heal fever or summon mild hallucinations. Angelica root, garlic, snowmelt, and faith, he says, the last word delivered with the same weary authority as a pharmacist saying take twice daily. You watch him pour the mixture into a tin cup, then hold it over a candle until steam begins to rise. The flame flickers, the metal hisses, and he hands it to a shivering knight with bandaged hands. The knight drinks, grimaces, mutters a prayer, and promptly sneezes hard enough to dislodge sin. Healing, the monk says, with no trace of irony. You can't help but respect his confidence, a mainstream historical fact worth remembering. The Teutonic Order maintained rudimentary hospitals in their fortresses, often staffed by lay brothers trained in herbal medicine and battlefield care. Contemporary records describe treatments involving vinegar compresses, snow as a disinfectant, and heated iron to cauterize wounds, a technique they called the Lord's Seal, presumably because screaming counted as prayer. These facilities weren't luxurious. They were cold triage centers where devotion substituted for anesthesia. Chroniclers bragged that the order's healers preserved both body and soul, which sounds noble until you realize they didn't yet believe in germs. You stare at a shelf holding surgical tools, scalpels, tongs, and something that looks like a small branding iron and wonder how many miracles here were just successful guesses. A patient on the next cot moans softly. His arm is bound in a splint made of wood and linen, crusted with frost. Another lies under a fur blanket, face pale but peaceful, either asleep or auditioning for sainthood. The monk moves between them like a slow metronome, checking pulses, whispering psalms, adjusting nothing because there's nothing to adjust. You catch a whiff of the salve he's spreading on someone's chest. It smells of garlic, beeswax, and faint hope. For breathing, he explains, though the man he's treating is making noises that suggest otherwise. You nod, because what else can you do? You're watching medieval healthcare in its purest form, equal parts superstition, endurance, and audacity. There's a quirky tidbit from a 14th century Baltic text that claims the Teutonic healers sometimes used melted snow from the monastery roof for holy water, believing its purity made it suitable for cleansing both wounds and sins. One marginal note even mentions that the monks preferred snow unkissed by birds, a level of selectiveness that feels deeply human. You can take away comfort, warmth, and flavor, but never bureaucracy. You picture a novice standing outside with a brass basin, waiting patiently for untainted flakes to fall, muttering about avian interference while trying not to freeze solid. Later he'll bring the snow inside, melt it, bless it, and pour it over some poor soul's arrow wound, announcing triumphantly that the chill draws out corruption. The corruption, predictably, stays. In the back of the room, a cauldron sits on a brazier, a rare luxury of fire in this frozen fortress. Inside, herbs float in bubbling water, the steam fogging the monk's spectacles, a miracle of glass that makes him look permanently bewildered. He lifts the lid, sniffs, nods in satisfaction. Cough draught, he says. You peer inside and see something greenish, viscous and moving in ways liquid shouldn't. Effective, you ask. He shrugs. If God wills it. You wonder how many medieval medical journals ended that way. The brazier crackles faintly, and the faint warmth makes you realize how utterly frozen your feet are. You shift closer, pretending you're checking the temperature, but really just soaking in the borrowed heat. The monk notices but doesn't scold you. Even the righteous must thaw, he says, pouring another ladle of steaming concoction into a cup. You smile for a moment. Faith feels pragmatic. Outside, someone shouts. Another injury, probably from slipping on ice rather than fighting pagans. Two squires drag in a man clutching his leg, armor dented, face twisted in pain. The monk sighs, sets down his cup and motions for them to lay him on a table that's seen better centuries. Fell from the rampart. One squire explains. Did the rampart survive? The monk asks dryly, cutting away the boot with surprising efficiency. You watch as he cleans the wound with what's left of the holy snow water, muttering words halfway between prayer and profanity. He'll limp for a season, he says, binding it with a strip of cloth that looks like it used to be a curtain. The patient groans. That's gratitude, the monk says, almost fondly. An open scholarly debate among historians of medieval medicine centers on whether the Teutonic Order's healers were truly ahead of their time or simply luckier than most. Some point to their relatively low mortality rates in fortified outposts as evidence of skill. Others argue it's just better insulation and stricter quarantine. The truth, as always, probably lies in between. A handful of herbs, a mountain of prayer, and an ocean of endurance. You think about that as the monk moves methodically from cot to cot, whispering Latin phrases over each patient like incantations. In a world this cold, words themselves have to burn a little to matter. When the room finally quiets again, you sit beside a window rimed with ice and watch the light fade. The snow outside glows faintly blue like a second moon has fallen, and decided to stay. The monk joins you, his hands stained with herbs, his face lined with fatigue. You look well, he says. You laugh softly, unsure if it's a compliment or an observation. I'm not sick, you reply. He nods. Not yet. You both stare at the horizon in silence, listening to the wind. After a long pause, he adds, faith is a good medicine, but it doesn't keep you warm. You glance at him, surprised by the honesty, and he shrugs. We all pray anyway. Habit heals too. You rise, stretch, and leave him to his work. The sound of the door closing echoes softly behind you, and the cold rushes in like an unwelcome truth. You walk past the rows of sleeping men, some muttering prayers, some lost to dreams of summer, and you realize that this whole fortress is an infirmary of sorts, everyone here wounded by the same invisible sickness called survival. You exhale, watching your breath fade into the corridor, and think of the monk's words again. Habit heals too. Maybe that's what this whole crusade has become. A long, stubborn habit of believing that endurance itself is curative. And as the wind sighs through the beams, carrying the faint scent of herbs and smoke, you start to believe it, just enough to keep walking. You climb the narrow wooden stairs of the watchtower, each step groaning beneath your boots like an old man with opinions. The air grows sharper as you ascend, colder, purer, and somehow lonelier. When you finally reach the top, the world has shrunk to a handful of lights below, the dull glow of the barracks, the faint shimmer of the chapel candle, and the occasional spark from a forge that refuses to die. The rest is silence and snow. You pull your cloak tighter, though it's more symbolic than effective, and lean against the railing. It's rough under your gloves, crusted with frost, and you can feel the wind push against you as if testing your resolve. Above, the sky stretches infinite and indifferent, studded with stars so sharp they could cut the night itself. You can't help but think they look like tiny spearheads, celestial reinforcements watching over this frozen war no one asked for. Below you, the camp is asleep, or pretending to be. You can make out the slow shuffle of sentries along the walls, their torches sputtering like tired thoughts. Somewhere a horse snorts, somewhere a monk coughs, somewhere a knight mutters a prayer he doesn't expect to be heard. It's the hour of quiet panic, that moment every night when you realize the cold isn't leaving, the dawn isn't rushing, and you're still alive out of sheer habit. You stamp your feet to stay warm, the sound muffled by snow. Your breath hangs in the air, a cloud of evidence that you still exist. You almost envy the ones sleeping below, though sleep here is just a truce with exhaustion. Up here you don't get truce, you get time to think, which is worse, a mainstream historical fact. The Teutonic Order's forts maintained constant night watches, even in the dead of winter, with shifts rotating every few hours to prevent frostbite and madness from pairing up. The watchtowers, usually built of timber and stone, served as both lookout and moral symbol, vigilance as virtue. Chroniclers record that missing a watch shift was punishable by penance, fasting, or flogging, though most men agreed the cold itself was sufficient punishment. You wonder what those watchmen saw through the endless dark, raiders, wolves, or just their own reflections in the black glass of the night. You scan the horizon. Nothing moves. The snow has smoothed everything into sameness, fields, forests, frozen rivers, all erased into one pale breath. The moon paints the landscape silver blue, so bright it almost tricks your mind into thinking it's day. But the silence gives it away. No birds, no creaking trees, just wind, the eternal narrator of places that have run out of dialogue. You listen to it sing through the arrow slits, a thin whine that sounds almost like a voice whispering your name. You shake your head, but the sound persists, curling around the edges of your thoughts like smoke. Maybe it's just the wind. Maybe it's the ghosts the monks keep writing about. A quirky tidbit from the Chronicon Terrae Prussia mentions that sentries during harsh winters often reported seeing white riders moving across the plains at night, pale figures on pale horses, silent as falling ash. Some claimed they were lost knights from earlier campaigns, doomed to patrol forever. Others swore they were just moonlit drifts mistaken for movement. One particularly poetic chronicler described them as angels of frost, carrying the weight of forgotten banners. You can almost see it now, spectral horsemen gliding across the snow, their armor glowing faintly, their faces hidden behind frozen visors. You blink, and for a heartbeat the illusion is real. Then the wind shifts, the stars wobble, and you're alone again. You laugh softly to yourself. Hallucination comes free with the night shift. Down below, a door creaks open. A faint line of golden light spills out before vanishing again, and the sound travels up to you. Faint but distinct. Someone's awake. Probably a monk fetching snow to melt for water, or a night too cold to stay still. Life continues. Even when it makes no sense to you turn back toward the horizon. A thin fog is rising now, curling over the ground like slow smoke. The river, barely visible under its shell of ice, exhales faint wisps of steam. You imagine it sighing in its sleep, dreaming of spring. For a moment, you envy it, too. You shift your weight and glance at the small brazier near your feet, an ember pit barely alive meant to keep the watchmen from turning into statues. It glows faintly, a fragile sun of dull orange. You crouch, extend your gloved hands and feel nothing. The heat doesn't travel far in this air. Still, the gesture comforts you. It's the same motion every night. Hands out, hope out. Maybe that's the point. You reach into your pocket and pull out a crust of bread from earlier. Chew slowly. It tastes like regret. You laugh softly again, the sound instantly torn away by wind. It's funny how quiet makes you talk to yourself. You start whispering stories to stay awake. Old songs, fragments of home, bits of gossip from the barracks. It doesn't matter what the words are. It's the speaking that counts. There's an open scholarly debate about the psychological toll of winter isolation on medieval soldiers. Some argue that the chroniclers' accounts of phantom armies and ghost patrols were metaphors for hallucinations brought on by hypothermia and exhaustion. Others claim they reflect a genuine mystical culture among the Teutonic Knights, who believed visions were messages from heaven. Standing here, your eyes raw from wind and your mind drifting like snow, you can see how both could be true. It's easy to believe in spirits when the only other option is loneliness. A low howl cuts through the night. You freeze, not the metaphorical kind this time. You lean over the railing, squinting into the dark. There, at the edge of the tree line, something moves. Just a shadow at first, then two, then three. Wolves, probably, or maybe just tricks of light. You hold your breath and listen. Nothing follows. The silence returns heavier than before. You exhale slowly. The men below will say it's a sign that God tests his soldiers through fear. You think it's just nature checking if anyone's left to notice. Your fingers ache, the joints stiff. You stamp your feet again, feel the splinters in the wood beneath your boots. The stars begin to fade, paling toward dawn. You realize with relief and disappointment that you've survived another watch. Relief, because you're still breathing. Disappointment, because you'll have to do it again tomorrow. The other sentry arrives, wrapped in a cloak so thick he looks like a walking snowdrift. "Anything to report?" he asks through his scarf. You shake your head. "Only ghosts," he grunts, nods and takes your place. You descend slowly, each step moaning in rhythm with your knees. When you reach the ground, the air feels almost warm by comparison. The first hint of gray morning light filters through the clouds, turning the snow to dull pewter. You walk back toward the barracks, the fortress yawning itself awake, horses stirring, doors creaking, men cursing the new day. As you glance back, the watchtower stands tall and skeletal against the sky, its top swallowed by mist. You think about the ghosts you didn't see, the voices you might have imagined, and decide that faith is just another kind of night watch, something you keep, even when you're not sure who's listening. You step inside, and the door shuts behind you with a heavy, echoing thud. The warmth, or what passes for it, wraps around you like a damp blanket. Somewhere, someone starts a hymn, slow and low, while another man snores through the chorus. You smile. Up in the watchtower, the next guard stamps his feet and peers into the snow, waiting for movement that may never come. The world keeps turning quietly, one breath at a time, and you realize that maybe that's the truest kind of vigilance, not watching for danger, but refusing to stop looking for meaning in the cold. You wake to the sound of barrels being pried open, the groan of frozen wood giving way to the dull, gritty sigh of salt shifting inside. It's not treasure, not grain, not gold, just salt. But here, in this frozen monastery fortress where life itself has a shelf life, salt is sanctity. You pull yourself upright, joints popping like small confessions, and follow the sound toward the storage cellar. The air grows colder the deeper you go, until your breath turns solid in front of you, and the torchlight trembles like it's reconsidering its job description. The door creaks open, and there it is, a room lined with barrels, each sealed with wax and branded with the Order's black cross. Inside them lies the mineral heartbeat of survival. Salt for preserving meat, treating wounds, making holy water, even seasoning a rare act of joy. A knight once joked that salt was the only thing that didn't freeze or complain, and standing here you start to believe it. The quartermaster, a stooped man with fingers so pale they might actually be salt, greets you with a nod. Inventory, he says, as if explaining creation itself. You watch him chip away a crust from one of the barrels, scoop a handful of crystalline flakes, and hold them to the torchlight. They sparkle briefly, tiny stars in a wooden universe. God's snow, he murmurs, not realizing you heard. The phrase fits. Everything sacred here has to be practical, and everything practical has to be sacred, or else no one would bother pretending it's worth the misery. A mainstream historical fact. Salt in the Baltic Crusader states was so valuable it was treated like currency. The Teutonic Order imported it from Lüneburg and the Hanseatic ports, guarded it like relics, and measured it with the precision of a miser counting indulgences. Chroniclers mention that soldiers were sometimes paid in salt during shortages, which gives new meaning to the phrase worth his salt. It preserved not just food but morale. Without it, rations spoiled, wounds festered, and tempers rotted faster than fish. You can almost hear the sermons that must have accompanied each barrel. As salt preserves flesh, so faith preserves the soul. Theology and logistics, hand in hand. You crouch beside an open barrel, run your gloved fingers through the crystals. They clink faintly, like tiny bells. The cold has turned them into pebbles that bite at your skin through the fabric. You taste a grain out of curiosity. Sharp, metallic, alive. It burns your tongue in the way truth does when you weren't ready to hear it. Behind you, one of the monks mutters a prayer as he measures out scoops into linen sacks, muttering numbers that sound suspiciously like scripture. Every handful is accounted for, every crystal weighed, because indulgence here doesn't come from Rome, it comes from rationing. You watch as they seal each sack with twine and a wax stamp, and for a moment, the scene feels like a sacrament. A quirky tidbit buried in a Prussian monastery record tells of one winter when a zealous brother sprinkled salt across the chapel threshold to ward off demons of frost. According to the chronicle, the next morning the floorboards had split from the moisture, and the abbot called it divine irony. Another entry mentions knights rubbing salt on their hands before sword practice to prevent frostbite. Half superstition, half science, mostly salt. There's even an anecdote about a monk who claimed to see the Virgin Mary's face appear in a salt crystal, only to have it melt when someone exhaled too close. You can imagine the disappointment and the committee meeting that followed. The wind howls faintly through cracks in the ceiling, scattering a few stray flakes of salt across the floor like snow that forgot its line in the play. You look up and realize how precious this room feels. It's a reliquary of the ordinary, a chapel of necessity. The monks treat the barrels with reverence, not because they're holy, but because they're irreplaceable. You wonder if modern people would ever kneel for something as mundane as seasoning. Probably not, unless it came with a Michelin star. The monk in charge, Brother Ulrich, lifts a handful of salt and lets it fall slowly, the grains cascading like frozen sand. This, he says, is what keeps us from turning to dust. His tone is half sermon, half weather report. You nod, watching the crystals fall, realizing he's right. Without it, every victory, every prayer, Every morsel of meat in the fortress would decay before the next sunrise. It's not divine fire that keeps them alive. It's these tiny, stubborn fragments of the earth's memory. An open scholarly debate lingers among historians of medieval religion. Did the Teutonic Knights truly believe salt carried spiritual power, or was their reverence purely practical? Some point to liturgical texts that equated salt with purity and preservation of the soul. Others insist it was just a convenient metaphor. The line between metaphor and survival, though, blurs easily when the world itself is frozen. Watching Brother Ulrich pour salt into a chalice for blessing, you decide it doesn't matter which came first, the faith or the habit. In this place, meaning doesn't grow from philosophy, it crystallizes from repetition. The blessing begins. A small group of brothers gathers, hoods drawn, breath rising like smoke. The monk dips a wooden cross into a bowl of brine and flicks droplets over the sacks, murmuring Latin that sounds half incantation, half inventory. Benedict, Domine, hoc sal. He begins, and for a moment you think he's about to bless the soup instead of the supply. The salt catches the candlelight, scattering it across the walls in tiny shimmering halos. You stand still, transfixed, realizing how beauty sneaks into even the most utilitarian rituals. It doesn't ask permission, it just arrives, stays a moment, and melts away again. When the blessing ends, the monks seal the barrels once more, pressing wax into the lids with signet rings. The smell of smoke and brine mingles in the air. One of them scoops a handful into a small pouch and ties it to his belt. Protection, he says. You raise an eyebrow. From hunger? He smiles faintly. From everything. There's humor there, but also something deeper. A medieval insurance policy that covers body and soul alike. You step outside again, blinking into the pale light. The wind licks at your face, carrying the faint scent of salt from your gloves. You lick your lips and taste it again. Sharp, alive, unmistakably human. Down in the courtyard, a knight scatters a pinch onto his meat. Another tosses some into his mug of beer, and a third rubs it into the flank of a wounded horse. 3 uses, 1 miracle. You can't help but laugh quietly. As the day fades, you look back at the tower and the walls, at the men who move like clockwork through their sacred chores, and it hits you how small the boundary really is between faith and preservation. Maybe the monks never needed miracles, just minerals. You breathe in deep, the air stinging your throat, and exhale through a smile. The fortress stands because of salt, prayer, and sheer stubborn chemistry. And in the quiet that follows, you decide that's holy enough. The feast begins, as most things do here. Not with laughter or music, but with the sound of wood complaining about existence. Long tables dragged across the floor, benches thudding, mugs clinking like weary bells. All of it orchestrated in a rhythm that would almost feel festive if it weren't happening in a room colder than most crypts. You watch as the knights gather, cloaks draped over armor, faces flushed red not from wine but from the kind of chill that could make a saint curse under his breath. The air smells faintly of smoke, tallow, and boiled barley, and the light from a dozen flickering candles barely touches the frost that rims the beams overhead. Still, it's a feast, or close enough to one that imagination will have to do the seasoning. At the center table, the commander sits, his white cloak stiff with ice, looking like a marble statue that someone decided should preside over dinner. Beside him, a monk blesses the meal with a hand so numb the cross he traces in the air wobbles dangerously close to becoming a circle. You bow your head with the others as he mumbles Latin through chattering teeth. When he finishes, the commander says, "Eat," and the room exhales in unison, the sound of hunger disguised as obedience. A mainstream historical fact to set the stage. During winter campaigns, the Teutonic Knights held communal meals known as fraternal tables, where everyone from commander to squire ate together in silence or prayer. Chroniclers describe the ritual as both discipline and morale control, each meal an act of shared endurance. Food was sparse, barley stew, salted fish, black bread, and the only luxury permitted was the occasional sip of spiced wine on holy days. You look around at tonight's spread and realize this must be one of those holy days, though the spices appear to have given up somewhere near Lübeck. A pot of stew arrives first, thick and gray, carried by 2 squires who look suspiciously young for such culinary responsibility. Steam rises faintly from the surface, curling into ghostly shapes before vanishing hope in vapor form. The first ladleful hits your wooden bowl with a dull splat. You stare at it, trying to identify ingredients. Barley, yes. Maybe turnip, possibly something that used to be meat. You take a cautious spoonful. It tastes like perseverance. Across from you, a knight mutters, "Needs salt." You almost laugh, remembering yesterday's sermon on that very subject. Faith may preserve the soul, but a pinch of sodium still helps the mood. The second course, if you can call it that, is dried fish, so stiff it could double as a weapon. The men bang it against the edge of the table to soften it, each crack echoing like distant thunder. Someone jokes that the fish were caught during the reign of the last emperor, and laughter ripples quietly through the hall, before dying under the weight of the commander's glare. Humor here is rationed too. You chew carefully, pretending not to notice that the candlelight reveals more bone than flesh. A quirky tidbit from a surviving Teutonic kitchen ledger notes that on especially cold nights, the knights would pour snow into their wine to make it last longer and bite less. You glance at your mug, half filled with something vaguely red, vaguely alive, and wonder how much history has frozen at the bottom. You take a sip anyway. It's lukewarm, vaguely sweet, and tastes like compromise. Around you, mugs are raised, and someone toasts St. George for courage, St. Bernard for warmth, and St. Whoever invented beer for everything else. The toast ends with a cheer that sounds more like a groan, and the hall echoes with the clatter of mugs meeting wood. The candles flicker, shadows dancing across armor and walls, and for a brief moment the room almost looks alive. A knight begins humming a tune. Soft, off-key, but recognizable. It spreads quietly, the way warmth does when it's earned. The melody is a pilgrim song about home, about green fields and bread that didn't break your teeth. The kind of song that's dangerous to sing out here because it reminds you of what's missing. Still, they hum it anyway, voices overlapping, filling the room with something that feels suspiciously like contentment. You close your eyes for a second, letting the sound roll over you. It's not beautiful, exactly, but it's human, and that's better. The commander, perhaps softened by the wine, stands and raises his mug. "To the brothers who endure," he says, "and to those who no longer do." The hall falls silent. For a heartbeat, the only sound is the wind sighing through the gaps in the walls. You drink with them, the liquid burning just enough to remind you that your throat still works. Then, as quickly as it came, the solemnity passes. Someone at the far table makes a joke about frozen fish confessing their sins before being cooked, and the laughter returns, quieter but real. An open scholarly debate persists about whether these winter feasts were acts of morale building or veiled penance. Some historians claim the silence and simplicity were meant to mirror monastic austerity, reinforcing the knight's spiritual mission. Others argue they were just too tired to talk. Judging by the slow, mechanical way the spoons move and the distant stares between bites, you lean toward the latter. Still, there's a kind of holiness in the routine, a rhythm that keeps despair from spilling over. Every meal here is a sermon in disguise. Patience, humility, digestion. When the bowls are finally empty, the squires bring out the dessert, if such a word can survive this climate. It's a handful of dried fruit, shriveled and sticky, dusted with more frost than sugar. You take one piece, chew slowly, and for a fleeting second it tastes like memory of summers, of orchards, of things that grew instead of froze. Around the hall, heads lift, eyes soften, and no one speaks. It's not reverence exactly, but something close, gratitude measured in silence. Afterward, the cleanup begins. The benches scrape, the bowls stack, and the squires move like ghosts collecting remnants of a vanished joy. The commander leaves first, his cloak sweeping behind him like a tired flag. The monk follows, carrying the last candle, its flame guttering as he walks. You stay seated a while longer, tracing the grain of the table with your finger, feeling the faint warmth left behind by your mug. It's not much, but it's enough. As you stand to leave, the wind outside moans through the shutters, and the smell of smoke and stew clings to your cloak. You glance back one last time. The empty tables, the fading candlelight, the frost creeping back over the plates, and realize that this, in its strange way, is victory. The knights may not feast like kings, but they've managed something rarer. They've made endurance taste like ritual. You step into the cold night, the air crisp and unkind, and whisper a small private toast of your own, to survival seasoned with faith. You wake in the middle of the night, not because of cold, that's constant, but because of sound, or rather something between sound and silence. A low, persistent murmur that slides through the walls like breath through cloth. At first you think it's the wind again, playing its usual tricks, whistling through cracks and gaps until it starts to sound almost human. But as you sit up, listening harder, you realize it isn't just the wind this time. There's rhythm to it, a strange, uneven cadence, like voices trying to remember how to speak. You glance around the barracks. The men are still asleep, slumped against their armor or each other, mouths half open, dreams frozen in progress. You pull your cloak tighter, stand slowly, and follow the sound. It seems to come from the courtyard, low and steady, rising and falling like waves under ice. You push open the door and step into the night. The sky is black glass, the snow glowing faintly under the thin moon. The air smells sharp, metallic, the kind of air that feels older than you. The whispering grows clearer now, threading between the walls and the trees beyond the gate. You tell yourself it's just the wind funneling through the palisades, but your body doesn't believe you. Goosebumps march up your arms in perfect formation. You move toward the chapel, its roof glistening under frost, its windows dim except for one flicker of candlelight. A mainstream historical fact. Teutonic chroniclers, especially Peter of Duisburg, noted the order's fascination with the supernatural. They saw ghostly visions not as madness but as moral test, apparitions of discipline, he called them. Proof that the soul must remain vigilant even when the flesh cannot. Records mention patrols hearing unseen processions outside their walls, bells that rang though the towers stood empty, and voices reciting scripture in languages no one could identify. Historians now debate whether these were hallucinations born of exhaustion or psychological manifestations of guilt, men haunted not by spirits but by their own survival. You think of that as you approach the chapel door, hand hovering over the latch. The whispering stops. Complete silence. Then a soft thud from inside, followed by another. You inhale sharply, exhale fog, and push the door open. The hinges complain, as always, but the sound seems louder tonight, too alive. Inside, the chapel is dim and blue, the single candle on the altar barely holding the darkness at bay. The flame leans sideways, struggling. You stand at the threshold, eyes adjusting, and there, by the far wall, you see them, two figures kneeling, heads bowed. For a moment, you relax. Just monks, you think, but then one lifts his head, slowly, impossibly slowly, and the light catches his face, pale, colorless, eyes open but blank. You blink, and they're gone. No movement, no sound, no trace, only the candles still flickering, the air suddenly colder, the silence heavier. You whisper a prayer, half habit, half insurance, and step closer to the altar. The stone feels colder than before, and when you rest your hand on it, moisture clings to your glove like dew that shouldn't exist indoors. You remember the graves beyond the eastern wall, shallow ones carved before the ground froze too hard for shovels. You remember how hastily they were covered, how the snow fell before the last rites finished. You tell yourself that memories, like bodies, shift in the dark. Still, you can't shake the feeling that someone's still out there trying to finish their prayer. A quirky tidbit from a surviving 14th century Baltic chronicle mentions that the Teutonic Knights believed the souls of fallen brothers lingered near their last post until the following spring, standing watch in unseen armor. During especially harsh winters, when the cold killed faster than battle, men claimed to hear the dead calling roll by name, an eerie litany that matched their military order: present, present, missing. Some monks claimed these were the voices of angels guarding the fort. Others quietly confessed they thought the ghosts were simply bored. Either way, the stories persisted. You can almost picture it, pale shapes walking the ramparts, breathless but vigilant, the eternal night watch. You kneel, partly in respect, partly because your knees feel weak. The candle flutters violently for a moment, as if caught in an invisible draught, then steadies again. You whisper, Requiem aeternam dona eis, but the Latin catches in your throat like frost. You add softly, and let them stay wherever they are. There's no answer, of course, though the silence feels suddenly more attentive. You stay like that a while, eyes half closed, until the cold seeps deeper, and even reverence can't keep you upright. Outside, the wind starts again, carrying a faint hum that might be song. It's hard to tell. It could just be timbers groaning, ropes straining, ice shifting, but you let yourself believe it's a hymn. It makes the night less cruel. You walk along the courtyard, your boots crunching in the snow, past the barracks and toward the wall. The torch by the gate flickers faintly, throwing shadows that look almost like people. For a second, you think you see movement. A line of figures, half translucent, walking toward the forest. They're in formation, silent, disciplined, heads held high. Then the light bends, and they dissolve into smoke. You don't chase it. Some things are better respected at a distance. An open scholarly debate exists among modern historians about whether such ghost stories were inventions meant to inspire fear or obedience within the ranks. The argument goes that in a world governed by ritual, the threat of divine or spectral witness kept men from breaking discipline. Others suggest these visions were the natural byproduct of deprivation, the brain's desperate attempt to find company in solitude. Standing here, though, feeling the cold in your teeth and the silence pressing against your chest, you suspect both are true. Faith and imagination drink from the same cup. It just depends who fills it first. You find yourself smiling softly, absurdly comforted. Maybe the whispers aren't warning or punishment. Maybe they're just proof that someone, somewhere, still remembers. The idea warms you more than any fire could. You turn toward the barracks, the wind now carrying a faint rhythm like slow footsteps behind you. You don't look back. You don't need to. If the dead are walking, they're keeping watch, not haunting. As you reach the door, you pause and glance at the tower rising above the walls, its silhouette cut sharp against the frozen stars. You raise a hand, a small salute to whoever or whatever keeps this place company through the long, merciless nights. Present, you whisper, the words steaming into the dark. For a moment, the wind stills as if answering in kind. Then it resumes, indifferent and eternal, carrying with it both silence and memory. You slip back inside, close the door behind you, and lie down beside your fellow knights. Their breathing fills the room like a tide, slow and heavy. You close your eyes, listening for the whispers again, but this time they sound softer, almost kind, like the snow brushing against the roof. Sleep comes easily, strange and deep, and as you drift away you think, maybe heaven isn't somewhere else, it's just the sound of comrades refusing to leave you alone in the cold. The morning breaks like a bruise, dark purple clouds bruising the horizon, wind pressing through the gaps in the tower like breath through clenched teeth. You wake to the sound of fabric snapping in the wind, that deep rhythmic thwap that feels both alive and ancient. It's the banner, the order's black standard, hanging stiff and rimed with frost from the pole above the gate. It doesn't wave so much as creak, half flag, half frozen sermon. You sit up, bones stiff, armor colder than scripture, and for a long moment you just stare at it through the open doorway of the hall. It's strange how something so lifeless can command such reverence. Every morning it's raised, every night it's thawed by breath, and somehow this ritual feels holier than half the prayers whispered here. You step outside, snow crunching like old paper beneath your boots, and tilt your head back to see the banner more clearly. It's enormous up close, a swath of black wool stitched with a white cross that's almost invisible now under layers of ice. The wind drags it sideways, pulling at the frozen threads until they hum faintly, like a harp made of frost. One of the squires stands at the base of the pole, rubbing his hands together for warmth, eyes fixed upward. He's been assigned to watch it, to make sure the symbol doesn't tear or tangle. You remember being that young, thinking symbols were immortal, that cloth and belief were made of the same thing. A mainstream historical fact. The Teutonic Knights banners were treated as relics of power and discipline, often blessed before battle and stored in sanctified chests between campaigns. Chroniclers recorded that losing a banner was considered not just a tactical defeat but a spiritual failure, one that required public penance and fasting to absolve. The banners bore different designs over time. Black crosses on white, white crosses on black, but each stood for the same impossible vow: purity through struggle, faith through frost. Even now, centuries later, fragments of those banners lie in museums, edges frayed but still defiant, like the ghosts of oaths that refuse to die. The wind picks up, and you see the squire's lips move. He's whispering something to the flag. Maybe a prayer, maybe a plea. You approach, and he startles, then smiles awkwardly. "It won't move," he says. You glance up again. The fabric is so stiff it could slice the air. "It will," you reply. "They always do, eventually. Even faith thaws." He frowns, unsure if that's wisdom or heresy. You grin and keep walking. The blacksmith's hammer rings from somewhere deeper in the yard, the steady rhythm of devotion in iron. A monk passes, clutching his robe against the wind. Behind him, 2 knights kneel beside the snow-covered graves of the brothers who didn't last the winter. They press their hands to the ground, whispering short prayers before rising and walking away without looking back. The banner snaps again overhead, and the sound feels heavier than the sky. A quirky tidbit from a 15th century Marienburg inventory lists 2 banners stiffened with ice, thawed by the breath of brothers and the warmth of candles before battle. The record doesn't specify whether the ritual was symbolic or desperate, though knowing medieval theology, it was probably both. You imagine it, a group of knights gathered around the flag before dawn, each taking turns exhaling on the frozen fabric, warming it enough to loosen the threads. A communion of frost and lungs, faith measured in condensation. Maybe they saw it as rebirth, the banner breathing again through them. Maybe it was just logistics. Either way, the image sticks, men reviving an idea with nothing but breath and belief. You walk toward the wall, where a second, smaller flag hangs limp, a signal marker for patrols. The snow clings to it like dust on a forgotten relic. You brush it off and notice the fabric is frayed, edges unraveling into long threads that dance in the wind. For a moment, you're tempted to pocket one, something to remind you that belief, even frayed, can still hold, but you leave it. Superstition has seniority here. The commander arrives a little later, his steps deliberate, his expression unreadable beneath the frost gathering in his beard. He stops by the banner, raises his gloved hand in salute, and stays that way for a full minute. Everyone in the courtyard follows suit automatically. The motion is slow, almost reverent, a gesture that feels less like obedience and more like habit made sacred by time. You do the same, arm trembling slightly, not from devotion but from cold. The commander lowers his hand, mutters something about vigilance, and walks away. The men disperse silently, returning to their routines. Only the wind continues the ceremony. There's an open scholarly debate about whether these rituals around banners were true acts of faith or disciplined theater designed to maintain morale. Some historians argue that the Teutonic Order's obsession with symbols, banners, crosses, colors, was an early form of psychological warfare, both inward and outward. Others see it as genuine mysticism, the embodiment of unity in a world where individuality was a liability. Standing here beneath the weight of that frozen cloth, you think it's both. The banner doesn't just represent belief, it replaces it, giving men something visible to worship when the invisible becomes too abstract. You move closer to the pole again, lay your hand on the wood. It's slick with ice, rough beneath, the vibration from the wind runs through it, a heartbeat transmitted by timber. You close your eyes and listen. The sound of the banner flapping above is strangely soothing, like breathing, or the turning of pages in an unseen book. You imagine the thousands of men who've heard the same sound over centuries, each one convinced it was meant for them. That's the trick of symbols. They speak to everyone in the same voice and convince each listener it's personal. As the day drifts on, the snow begins to fall again. Light, soft, almost apologetic. The flakes catch on the banner, clinging to its surface until it looks less like a war standard and more like a burial shroud. The wind dies for a moment, and in that silence, the fabric sags, folds inward, and rests against the pole. You feel a pang of recognition. It's tired too. You whisper without meaning to, "Rest, brother." The word vanishes into the cold, but somehow it feels heard. Evening settles slow and heavy. The banner darkens against the twilight, its cross barely visible now, a ghost on cloth. The squire returns with a torch, circling the pole 3 times before kneeling at its base. You watch from a distance as he cups his hands around the flame, thawing a small patch of ice from the fabric's edge. A single droplet falls, gleaming, then disappears into the snow. It's a small, ridiculous gesture, but also the most human thing you've seen all day. When you finally turn back toward the barracks, the wind catches again, and behind you the banner stirs, slowly, reluctantly, then fully, rising and snapping once more into motion. It sounds like applause or warning, or maybe both. You pause, listening. For a moment, the white cross glows faintly against the black, like a memory refusing to fade. You smile, though your lips crack from the cold. You whisper one last salute into the dusk. Fly if you can, stay if you must. And as you walk away, the banner answers in its own frozen language. A soft, steady thwop, 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 like the heartbeat of a faith too stubborn to die. You walk through the courtyard, boots crunching softly, and glance upward out of habit. Still nothing. Just the sky pretending to be stone. Someone once told you that the Baltic winter could last 40 days without proper sunlight, though time here stretches like taffy, so it might as well be forever. The man moves slowly, wrapped in layers that make them look more sculpture than human. Their breath fogs in steady rhythm, a congregation of ghosts rehearsing eternity. You pass a monk hauling a bucket of water from the well, his hood rimmed with frost, his expression neither suffering nor serenity, just endurance. A mainstream historical fact. Chroniclers wrote that during the longest winters, Teutonic Knights used polished metal shields or hand mirrors to catch and reflect even the faintest glimmers of sunlight onto altars and holy icons, believing that light itself was a form of divine presence. A 14th century account from Königsberg mentions brothers who placed mirrors upon the ramparts to summon God's warmth from the clouds, a mixture of faith, science, and wishful optics. Modern historians debate whether it was metaphor or literal practice. You can't help but imagine it. A line of armored men holding mirrors toward a blank sky, catching nothing but their own pale reflections, and calling it prayer. You find yourself smiling at the thought, though the humor feels fragile. The cold doesn't just numb the body here, it gnaws at memory, blurring where faith ends and survival begins. You stop near the wall, where the snow piles higher than your knees, and notice faint tracks leading toward the watchtower. Probably one of the night guards returning late, or maybe just the wind reshaping its own footprints. In this endless twilight, you start to question evidence itself. You can't tell where day turns to evening, or whether it ever does. It feels like being trapped inside the pause between breaths. From somewhere near the chapel, a bell rings. Slow, deliberate, hollow. It's meant to mark the morning prayer, though the sound feels more like an apology than a call. You follow it anyway. Inside, the candles have been replaced with oil lamps, their flames barely convincing against the gloom. The air smells of wax, sweat, and wet wool. The brothers kneel in silence, murmuring psalms too quietly for meaning, their voices blending into one long sigh. The priest reads from the Book of Hours, his voice steady but thin. Et lux perpetua luceat ace, let perpetual light shine upon them. You glance at the window and think, not today, Father. A quirky tidbit buried in an obscure Prussian monastic note claims that during these sunless stretches, some brothers began painting yellow circles on the walls and ceilings to remind themselves of daylight, primitive halos of hope. Others swore by fire rituals, lighting torches at noon even when the sun didn't appear, insisting it must be midday somewhere in Christendom. You like that one. You picture a man standing in the snow, torch raised to an invisible sun, defiantly punctual for a celestial appointment no one else attends. It's both absurd and noble, two things that often keep people alive. You leave the chapel after prayer, the sound of Latin fading behind you. The air outside feels heavier now, the sky lower. You walk toward the stables where the horses shift restlessly, their eyes glinting like coins in the half-light. They sense it too, the strange fatigue that comes from never seeing shadows. Even the birds have gone silent, their songs replaced by the distant creak of wood under frost. Somewhere, a knight laughs quietly at something, the sound startling in its warmth. It's gone too soon. An open scholarly debate continues among historians about how such prolonged darkness affected the psychology of medieval garrisons. Some argue it deepened spiritual introspection, forcing men inward toward prayer and contemplation. Others suggest it drove them to superstition and melancholy, citing letters that describe visions of lights in the air, and the sun that blinked but never woke. Standing here, you think both could be true. The human mind, like ice, cracks along invisible lines when pressure builds. Faith fills those cracks, at least until morning. You stop near the wall where a small mirror has been nailed. Angled upward, its surface is cloudy, the glass warped, but you can just make out a faint shimmer, maybe sunlight, maybe torchlight, maybe the wish for either. You lean closer and catch your own reflection. Distorted, half ghost, half soldier. You whisper to it, still here, as if checking attendance with yourself. The reflection nods back, solemn and silent. You can't help but laugh softly. That's the thing about this endless twilight. It teaches you to hold conversations with anything that listens, even if it's just the air wearing your face. Later, as the meal bell rings, you join the others in the hall. The stew is the same as always, lukewarm and forgettable, but tonight it tastes faintly of smoke. Someone must have burned the oats again, and no one complains because it adds variety. The men eat in silence, spoons scraping bowls in a slow mechanical rhythm. Every now and then someone glances toward the narrow window, as though waiting for light that refuses to arrive. You do it too, involuntarily, catching the faintest shift of gray outside, and wondering if it counts as hope. When the meal ends, you step back into the courtyard. The wind has stilled completely now, the world holding its breath. The snow glows faintly under the colorless sky, turning the fortress into a lantern without flame. For the first time all day, you sense something different. Not warmth, not light, but a stillness so deep it feels almost kind. You close your eyes, let the cold air settle on your skin, and imagine the sun behind the clouds, its patient, invisible presence. Maybe it's there, waiting, not gone but resting. You open your eyes again. The world hasn't changed, but you feel slightly less hollow. The mirrors on the walls catch some hidden gleam, a flash so faint it could be imagined. But here, imagination is just another name for survival. You turn toward the barracks, boots crunching softly on the snow, and whisper a small thank you to whatever light still lingers, unseen but stubborn. After all, faith doesn't need fire to burn. It just needs a reason not to go out. By the time the thaw begins, you hardly believe in warmth anymore. The cold has rewritten your understanding of time. Days folded into nights, weeks crushed into a single breath of frost, and so when it happens, when the first drop of melted snow slides down the side of the wall and splashes into mud, it feels more like a rumor than a season. You watch it happen, that small glisten on stone, and it's as if the fortress itself is weeping from exhaustion. The air smells different now, heavier, sweet in strange ways, carrying hints of rot and life at once. You step outside and hear it everywhere, the slow, deliberate dripping of ice, the whisper of water reclaiming movement, the quiet sigh of the earth turning over in its sleep. The men don't celebrate. Not yet. No one trusts the first thaw. You've seen winters here fake their own death before, only to come back colder out of spite. Still, the change is undeniable. The snowbanks have softened, their edges collapsing like old resolve. Patches of brown earth peek through, raw and trembling under the sun, or what passes for sun, that pale coin hovering uncertainly behind thin clouds. For the first time in months, you feel light on your face. It's weak, barely warm enough to matter, but it's real. You close your eyes and let it sink into your eyelids like a memory you've been waiting to remember. A mainstream historical fact. In the chronicles of the Teutonic Order, the arrival of spring was both relief and reckoning. Winter hid the world beneath mercy's camouflage. Frozen rivers became walls. Snow buried failure. But the thaw exposed everything. Rotten stores, broken weapons, unburied dead. The monks called it the season of revealing. Every fortress faced inventory not of supplies but of souls. You think about that as you walk past the courtyard, where the black banner now hangs limp and wet, its once stiff fabric dripping quietly into a puddle the color of tarnished silver. Faith, too, sags a little under the weight of melting ice. The horses stamp in their stalls, restless. Their coats shed clumps of old hair, tufts floating through the air like gray snowflakes. You run your hand along one mare's neck and feel warmth again. Actual warmth, muscle and breath and blood. She snorts softly, tilts her head toward you as if reminding you that the world didn't stop after all. Behind you, a monk opens the stable door wider to let in light, and for a heartbeat, the beam of sun cuts through the haze like revelation. You see dust motes, glittering, suspended, tiny saints dancing between seasons. A quirky tidbit from a late 14th century Livonian journal describes how the knights celebrated the thaw by washing their armor in melted snow mixed with vinegar and ashes, part purification, part practicality. To cleanse the spirit and the steel, it says, for both have grown dull. You can almost picture it, men scrubbing rust while humming psalms out of tune, laughter shaking loose for the first time in months. Maybe they even joked that the vinegar smelled like Easter. Maybe that was enough to make it holy. By midday, the fortress becomes a chorus of noise. Water runs along the gutters, drips from rooftops, splashes into barrels. The sound of hammers returns, the blacksmith mending tools, the carpenters patching the breaches that ice and wind had gnawed open. The rhythm of labor replaces the rhythm of prayer, and it's almost music. You walk past the open gate and see the forest beyond, a smear of dark green and gray, where snow still clings in shadows. The air tastes faintly of sap, that sharp sweetness that only appears when trees remember they're alive. The world feels like it's breathing again, though each inhale seems hesitant, as if afraid of what comes next. An open scholarly debate lingers about how the order interpreted renewal after such winters. Some argue they saw spring as divine vindication, proof that endurance was rewarded. Others suggest it stirred quiet doubt. If faith is fire, why does it wait for sunlight to work again? You consider both as you stand near the thawing moat, watching chunks of ice drift lazily downstream. They look like fragments of old prayers, cracked but still floating. You find Brother Ulrich near the granary, his face flushed not from cold this time but from motion. He's taking inventory, marking what survived. The barley endured, he says, tapping the ledger. The meat less so. God's balance. He grins faintly, and the salt, of course, never failed us once. You laugh softly, remembering his words from months ago. This keeps us from turning to dust. Maybe he was right. The salt remains, white and solid. Even now, it glints faintly in the sunlight like powdered faith. Later that afternoon, the commander calls a brief assembly in the courtyard. His voice is hoarse, cracked from months of silence. "Brothers," he says, "the river moves again. We will move with it." Simple words, but they echo across the stones like prophecy. The men nod, murmuring prayers, their voices blending with the steady drip of meltwater. For once, no one looks tired. They just look lighter. You realize that the true miracle of spring isn't warmth, it's forgiveness. The chance to believe again without needing to explain why you stopped. As dusk approaches, the fortress glows differently. The light bends gold now, not gray. Puddles mirror the sky, and for a brief moment the clouds split enough to reveal the sun fully. Round, distant, merciful, its reflection dances on the surface of the melting snow, rippling across the faces of men who forgot how to smile without wincing. Someone begins to sing softly at first, then louder. The melody is old, a hymn of travel and return. The words don't matter. The sound itself is enough. You hum along without thinking, the vibration in your throat feeling foreign, fragile, human. As night falls, the temperature dips again, but the difference is subtle. The cold no longer bites. It lingers. You step outside one last time before rest, drawn to the sight of the black banner hanging quietly above the gate. It no longer snaps in defiance, no longer glistens with ice. It just moves gently, swaying with the slow rhythm of the thawing wind. Beneath it, water drips from the eaves in a steady cadence, like the ticking of a clock that's decided to start again. You breathe deeply, the air thick with earth and renewal, and feel something loosen in your chest. The fortress, the men, the silence, they've all survived themselves. Maybe that's enough. You close your eyes, letting the sounds of melting fill the world around you. The drip, the hum, the sigh of timber, the quiet shuffle of a horse dreaming of green pastures. Everything softens, even your thoughts, until it all feels distant and slow and kind. And as you begin to drift towards sleep, the last thing you hear is that tender symphony of water and wind, the frozen world remembering how to move again. The words come to you unbidden, carried by breath, simple and certain. The long thaw is not an ending, it's proof that even ice believes in morning. End of script. Sweet dreams.